Hello, my name is Priya Urs. In this module titled Constitutions and Constitutionalism, I'm going to briefly introduce the concept of constitutionalism in constitutional law and some of the discussions and debates that have taken place around it. To begin with, I would like to briefly outline the learning outcomes of this module in the form of some important questions that will help understand what constitutionalism is about and how this concept has and continues to evolve over time. The first question that I consider is, what purposes is a constitution intended to serve? This is important because it provides the context in which constitutionalism developed and the need for constitutionalism as a tool in the drafting and interpretation of constitutions. The second and related question is, what features must a constitution include in order to fulfill these objectives? The third is looking more specifically at constitutionalism as an idea or a concept, and the difficulties in defining this concept. The next question is, how does constitutionalism influence the drafting, implementation, and interpretation of constitutions? Next, I look at what is the dominant discourse in constitutionalism today. So here I discuss the development of liberal or modern constitutionalism and some of the features that have come to be associated with this theory of constitutionalism. And finally, I look at the limitations of liberal modern constitutionalism and how these have been remedied by alternate theories of constitutionalism. Looking at the first question that I posed, what is the purpose that a constitution is intended to serve? Now, we already know that a constitution serves many purposes, but the primary purpose, I would say, is that it defines the scope of government power and it establishes the institutions that are intended to exercise this power. It also encapsulates the ideology of a particular society and also its values and principles. In this context, it is also relevant that some constitutions may encapsulate the society's aspirational goals as well. Increasingly, constitutions today also include fundamental rights, individual or group rights, and fundamental freedoms. Constitutions that are drafted also in recent times have also included the state's international obligations, which is considered to be increasingly relevant in recent constitution-making exercises. Moving on to the concept of constitutionalism, there's been a lot of debate in the legal discipline and in related disciplines like political science about what constitutionalism is, and there has been no real consensus about what this term encompasses. But there has been a very fundamental or basic degree of consensus among scholars. The constitutionalism principle in this form requires that all government action comply with the Constitution. So accordingly, there can be no claim to authority that originates outside of the constitutional text. And as you can see, since this is a very basic understanding that simply requires compliance with the constitutional text, no matter what it says, in this view, constitutionalism is a very flexible term. And this is where the distinction between thin and thick forms of constitutionalism arises. So what I just described to you is a thin form of constitutionalism, which basically suggests that constitutionalism is a set of rules or norms that create, structure, and define the limits of government or authority. In this way, we understand constitutionalism to be merely an allocation of power, merely defining the scope of government authority. And this is clearly a very broad definition that encompasses a wide variety of power arrangements, which include not only democratic forms of government, but also monarchies and dictatorships. And it is because of this broad definition that some scholars began to identify problems with thin forms of constitutionalism, because they enable undemocratic authority to claim legitimacy from the Constitution. So as long as, for example, the power of a dictator is derived from some constitutional text, it would be a legitimate exercise of power, even if it is undemocratic. So it was at this point that scholars began to realize that constitutionalism should perhaps mean something more. And so they tried to confer upon this term greater clarity and specificity. And so, as we understand constitutionalism today, it is associated with a number of other features or requirements. You commonly might read that a constitution should be enduring, that it must constitute a superior law above other ordinary laws. It must be more difficult to amend than ordinary laws. It must reflect the shared goals of a particular society, and so on and so forth. And in this way, a number of scholars began to be more clear about what constitutionalism should require of the constitutional text. But regardless of whether a society adopts thin or thick forms of constitutionalism, there's a broad consensus that constitutionalism is a commitment to the principle of rule of law. And the concept of rule of law itself developed out of the acknowledgement that state authorities should be subjected to the law and should not be above the law. So today we can see that in most constitutions of the world, all organs of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, are all regulated by law, and specifically they are regulated by the constitutional text. So in this way, the constitutional text did not only confer authority upon government, but also, and crucially, limited this authority. So it was this notion of limited government that marked the emergence of liberal or modern constitutionalism, which is what I will now discuss in greater detail. The emergence of liberal constitutionalism as a discourse and some of the important features of liberal constitutionalism. First, I will discuss the theory of limited government. Next, I will go on to discuss the separation of powers doctrine, followed by the related power of judicial review, and finally, fundamental rights and freedoms in the liberal constitutional discourse. The theory of limited government developed in the 18th century and arose, as I mentioned, out of the need to limit the power of political institutions. And so now it is well established that a commitment to modern constitutionalism implies a commitment to limit the scope of government power and to prescribe the method for its exercise. So in different periods in history, we have seen an increasing commitment to this principle. For instance, during the decolonization period, independence constitutions tried to apply this principle in the drafting processes. So also with the collapse of communism, a number of countries that emerged adopted the principle of limited government. And so now it is quite undisputed that modern constitutionalism embraces the idea that political power should not be exercised arbitrarily, and the principle of limited government ensures this. Modern constitutionalism has also been influenced by other liberal principles. For instance, because it is rooted in social contract theory, the ideology of individualism is also present, and as a result, modern or liberal constitutionalism tends to emphasize and assert individual rights and liberties. And we see this appearing in the other features of liberal constitutionalism. For instance, in the importance that is attributed to human rights and fundamental freedoms, and also with the power of judicial review that is considered very important in liberal constitutionalism. The next important feature of liberal constitutionalism is the separation of powers doctrine, which first originated as a distinct feature of American constitutional law, and it arose out of the need to restrict the spheres of authority of the organs of the state, of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, and with a view to avoiding or resolving conflicts among them. And today, many countries have applied the separation of powers doctrine, including the Indian Constitution, which also recognizes it to some extent. And I think this feature of constitutionalism tells us something more fundamental about the role of a constitutional text. Now, it is important to outline clearly what the powers of each institution are, because of the likelihood of conflicts that will arise among them, disputes over aims, over values and competences that will often arise and are expected to arise. So, regardless of whether a constitution does implement the separation of powers doctrine, it is important that every political system have some mechanism for maintaining dialogue among institutions and for resolving the disputes that arise among them. The separation of powers doctrine also led the way towards another important feature of liberal or modern constitutionalism, which is the power of judicial review that is conferred upon judiciaries in many countries today. So, a lot of constitutions emphasize the need for the independence of the judiciary because courts are considered as protectors of the Constitution. And many scholars now consider the power of judicial review as the hallmark of modern constitutionalism. And as you can see in many countries, for instance, in Germany or in South Africa, there are powerful constitutional courts that protect integral constitutional values. And in India as well, for example, the Supreme Court has played a considerable role in protecting constitutional values by developing the basic structure doctrine, by protecting and expanding fundamental rights, and so on. At the same time, however, there have been more recent concerns about the basis for the power of judicial review. Now, there have been a lot of criticisms that judicial review and transferring a power of this sort upon a non representative institution like the judiciary is anti democratic. And in this view, it is important to realize that constitutional supremacy should not be equated to judicial supremacy. So courts, in interpreting or protecting the Constitution, should not take away the representative power of the legislature and the executive in drafting and in implementing the laws. This gives rise to a conflict that might arise between the concept of constitutionalism and the democratic principle. But I think the relationship between these two values is quite complex and is something that I will discuss a little later on. For now, I would just like to point out that it is important for a judiciary to maintain its legitimacy in the society and to respect the other institutions and their functions. This can be ensured by the judiciary refusing to answer, say, political questions or getting involved in political discussions in its decision making. And instead, it would probably be best for the judiciary in protecting constitutional values to focus, for example, on the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, which brings me to the final feature of liberal constitutionalism that I'm going to discuss. The inclusion of fundamental rights and freedoms in the liberal constitutional framework reflects some of the fundamental principles of liberalism. So, for instance, the inclusion of civil and political rights reflects the ideology of individualism. But it's important also to keep in mind that the fundamental rights and freedoms that are often associated with liberal constitutionalism are not only defensive checks on the exercise of power by the state, but may also be positive entitlements. So many constitutions today that adopt the liberal constitutional discourse recognize not only political and civil rights, but also socio-economic rights and cultural rights. And the need for the inclusion of all these rights is justified by the importance of the respect for individual human worth and dignity that is fundamental to liberalism. Some would suggest and have also suggested that the inclusion of human rights in constitutional texts is a recent phenomenon. I wouldn't say that this is entirely accurate because the inclusion of fundamental rights and freedoms in constitutions is certainly not new, and I think the US Constitution is a perfect example of that. But at the same time, there has been a trend towards including more and more rights within the constitutional texts. In pluralistic or multi-ethnic or multi-religious societies especially, there has increasingly been a recognition of minority rights or group rights. And again, the conferment and recognition of these rights might sometimes come into conflict with the principle of majority rule or the democracy principle. And this now brings me to the next section of my presentation, in which I discuss the relationship between constitutionalism and competing values. And as I already mentioned before, there seems to be an inherent conflict between the concept of constitutionalism and the principle of democracy rule or majority rule. So now I will just briefly discuss some of the aspects of this conflict and whether in fact it can be resolved. So what makes constitutionalism problematic is that it commits itself to constitutional values beyond the reach of a majority decision. And the question really is whether this undermines the liberal assumption that the exercise of popular sovereignty in creating the constitution is then limited by it, and whether this should be permitted. And I think in order to resolve this conflict, it is important to recognize that democracy is only one among many values that need to be balanced out in a constitutional framework. And this is important to recognize because democracy is a principle that can easily be manipulated. For instance, it can be manipulated to create less democratic forms of power. And it can also be manipulated to simply disregard other constitutional values. So, in this sense, democracy means a lot more than merely majority rule. And in this way, it should be qualified by the rule of law or by constitutionalism. And so we can balance out these two principles. The need to restrict the power of the majority thus arises out of a commitment that is made that certain fundamental values need to be preserved against majority decision making. And this is useful in many ways. So first, for instance, the majority may simply disregard fundamental rights and freedoms in order to accomplish collective goals. And so it is important to entrench fundamental rights and freedoms in the constitutional text in order to prevent the derogation of these rights. A second important aspect is that constitutions, particularly in pluralistic societies, often recognize and entrench the rights of minorities to protect minority interests against the decisions of the majority. And as you can see in many different examples, this is often made as an important political compromise at the time in which the constitution is drafted or when the state comes into existence. And so in multi-ethnic states, in order to maintain political and also social stability, the protection of minority rights against democratic or majority decision making is often very crucial. A good example to illustrate this is the constitution in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in which there are three ethnic communities that have entered into a power sharing agreement with one another to ensure that their interests are protected wherever each of these minorities geographically is a minority. A third important reason why the democratic principle should be limited is because a democratically elected legislature should be prevented from reallocating power to its own benefit by enacting a law and by exercising a majority vote. So in this way, a constitution can clearly provide for the divisions of power between different organs, different branches or levels of government, including even local institutions. And in this way, it can prevent parliament or legislature from reallocating this power in a less democratic way. So these three reasons help us understand why the Constitution must maintain supremacy even over the decisions of a majority. And it is for this reason that constitutional amendment in many countries is quite an elaborate process and involves more than just a simple majority, and often involves a substantial majority. So, in this way, the procedure for amendment must involve a process of negotiation in which there is an opportunity for all constitutionally defined rights of all the parties involved to be respected and to be balanced with one another. So, to conclude just our discussion of constitutionalism and democracy, we can see that, in fact, constitutionalism facilitates the existence and functioning of a democratic political system because it creates an orderly and clear framework in which political decisions can be made. And so, for this reason, constitutionalism and the rule of law more generally are essential to and are not, in fact, in conflict with the democratic principle. Moving now to the last part of my presentation, I would like to talk about some changing ideas of constitutionalism and some of the scholarship that sort of challenges liberal or modern constitutionalism and identifies its limitations. Liberal constitutionalism has been the dominant normative model for constitutions in most parts of the world. And it has been very useful in bringing about a lot of certainty about what constitutionalism is and what a constitution is intended to achieve in a given society. But the relevance of the features of liberal constitutionalism have been challenged today. And this is in part because the drafting of constitutions have increasingly been influenced by new and different forces, and also because societies today are changing, and as a consequence, their needs are changing, and it's not always sufficient to look to the features of liberal constitutions, like separation of powers, the importance of human rights, fundamental freedoms, to resolve the problems faced by modern societies. So the first trend is the move towards international constitutionalism. The concept of international constitutionalism has developed for two reasons. The first, the growth of comparative constitutional law and the recognition that there are commonalities among countries and among constitutions across the world. The second is the increase in foreign or international involvement in the drafting of constitutions or in constitution making processes. So, the development of universally accepted norms has resulted in the globalization of modern constitutionalism. So, now the tendency, at least in this view, is to look to common values that are accepted internationally rather than focusing more narrowly on liberal constitutional values. This seems to challenge the traditional understanding of a constitution as emerging from the specific context, history, and political traditions of a particular society. And global constitutionalism that many people recognize as involving values and rights recognized in international law typically includes human rights, but it is important also to recognize that international constitutionalism does recognize other institutional values as well. For instance, it may include separation of powers, the rule of law, good governance, and issues not only limited to international human rights law. The difficulty that often arises, though, in the context of this international constitutionalism is identifying the commonalities that do actually exist at a global or international level, and trying to make sure that these common values or principles are not, again, just associated with liberal constitutionalism alone. A second recent trend, in addition to international constitutionalism, is a more fundamental challenge to the liberal constitutional discourse, that liberal constitutionalism is very limited in its applicability. As Professor David Feldman argues, as a normative model, liberal constitutionalism can be a useful aid when designing constitutions for societies in which there is a consensus that liberal, broadly individualistic values should be the foundation for the structure of the state. So, as has been the experience in many countries today, this definition is very narrow and does not apply broadly to experiences across the world. Many states, for instance, religious states like in Islamic countries, and many African states have also had a lot of challenges in trying to implement liberal constitutional frameworks. And another important development today that liberal constitutionalism cannot seem to handle is the question of ethnicity. Ethnicity has become an important consideration in the drafting of constitutions today, and it is one that cannot be addressed by liberalism's individual-centric approach. And so, as a result, in a lot of pluralistic societies, liberal constitutionalism has very simply failed. So, this is the limitation of liberal constitutionalism, that it is virtually impossible to maintain a commitment to it across cultures and across different contexts. And as a result, the utility of liberal constitutionalism ends at the simple normative argument that all states should implement it. But as experience has shown, all states cannot implement it. And so there is a line of scholarship now that argues that constitutionalism should not advocate substantive constitutional values and structures of government. And this seems to be a return to thin forms of constitutionalism. It seems to be a reversal of what liberal constitutionalism was trying to achieve by suggesting that the features and the values that liberal constitutionalism sort of promotes may not necessarily be what is good for every single society and for every single state. In order to address the deficiencies of liberal constitutionalism, these challenges seem to, in moving towards thin forms of constitutionalism again, these views suggest that constitutionalism should instead focus on mediating and resolving disputes, not only among institutions but also within them. And so, by focusing on the need to manage conflict within a constitutional framework, this idea of constitutionalism requires that institutions should justify their decisions and their actions in accordance with the Constitution. And by making this commitment, institutions are better able to resolve disputes among themselves. And I think it's important to note that these broad goals are also the same goals that were that liberal constitutionalism tried to address and has addressed in more specific ways. But I think experience has taught us that these individual-centric principles cannot necessarily work in every social and political context. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope it has been a useful introduction and that it will help understanding the broader context of the other more specific modules that will follow. In the written module, I have also included some further readings that might be helpful in understanding constitutionalism better and in discussing constitutionalism in the context of specific countries or specific traditions. Thank you.